The salt then flows into the centrifuges, where it is finally washed with seawater, which eliminates all remaining impurities and dissolves all traces of other salts, leaving the salt spotless and white. After being washed, the salt is carried by conveyor belts and deposited in piles. These great mountains of salt are typical of the landscape of salt exploitations. Piles are an easy way to store salt and protect it against unkind weather, as rainwater runs down the walls of these salt pyramids without stagnating on their surface. This way, the dissolution of the salt is prevented. Then, the salt grains or pieces of very different sizes are ground in rollers in order to obtain the right dimension, depending on its final use. After the grinding process, the salt is prepared for the different uses it will have. The beauty of the crystallization process is uniquely captured by Torreportal art craft. Models of ancient clipper-style boats made of cotton are placed in the salt marsh so that the salt adheres to the cotton, creating beautiful shapes of crystallized salt. These boats, encrusted in salt crystals, represent an exquisite gift from the city, the salt lakes, and nature itself. But seawater does not only contain sodium chloride. There are different percentages of other minerals such as calcium sulfate, more familiarly known as gypsum, magnesium salts, calcium salts, or bromine. This is why sea salt is so much more beneficial to the body in comparison with other salts. There are two basic types of salt, humid salt and dry salt. The humid salt is the salt resulting from the washing process described above. It's called humid because even after it is dried, it continues to maintain a 3% of humidity. The dry salt, however, will undergo another wash meant to leave it even whiter, and then pass through a furnace that will eliminate that small percentage of residual humidity. This last step gives it optimal properties. For example, it doesn't form lumps, which makes it adequate for certain purposes such as cooking. After grinding, the salt is passed through a special set of filters. The sieves consist of metal planks onto which the salt is placed, which have small holes through which the grains of salt pass. As the particles are of different dimensions, the ones that do not fit in these holes are retained. This is how the grains can later be sorted by their size and packaged accordingly. Once it has been ground and separated according to particle size, the humid salt is named differently according to its dimension: coarse salt, brine salt, stabilizing salt, ground salt, common salt, or superfine salt. As dry salt is the result of a more recent and modern process, it is given numerical cataloguing: Type 00, Type 1, Type 2, 3, or 4. The process of salt crystallization begins in early June due to the heat and ends in October, when winter begins to bite in the salt lakes, filling them with rainwater and causing the crystallization to stop. The collection of salt begins at the end of June. To quote a popular saying, "It's figs and salt for San Juan." The collection may be extended throughout the whole year, as even when the production of salt stops, the salt remains at the bottom. The already crystallized salt does not disappear, despite the lowering of the level of salinity, since a total change of the water in the lake would be necessary in order to dissolve all the salt formed at the bottom. In addition, a foil of about 80 centimeters covers the crystallized salt or brine, acting as a barrier against new water or rainwater due to its greater density, and this way avoiding the disappearance of the salt. Formerly based on the natural process described earlier, the production of salt from the salt lakes was of about 300,000 tons a year. Today, thanks to the mechanization and modernization of the process, the production has reached some 700,000 tons, but this significant increase is also due to another factor. In 1970, we began to extract and transport salt from the Pinoso diapir, or salt dome. Diapirs are concentrations of underground salt water, which were formed more than 200 million years ago out of inland seas of the Tertiary period that evaporated and resulted in massive salt deposits. Over the years, the salt was covered with sediments and buried deeply beneath them. When subjected to great pressure, salt becomes fluid, that is, it turns into a toothpaste-like liquid and begins to flow upward in search of an exit. As a lot of pressure is applied on it during its ascent, it re-solidifies, creating the so-called salt domes that are often mushroom-shaped. As it happens, one of these domes is in Pinoso. Salt is extracted from it through wells and carried by a 53-kilometer pipeline to the Torrevieja lagoon. This process improves the activity of the old salt lake facilities, especially as climatic conditions used to cause the salt production to plummet during seasons of heavy rainfall or intense cold, as the evaporation process and the production of optimum salt concentration were compromised. We must note that salt is a product with no less than 14,000 different uses. Although the most widely known one is the preparation of food, this use is, paradoxically, its least common purpose. Its use in processes such as the making of glass, the manufacturing of PVC, the textile, chemical, and pharmaceutical industry is much more common. The biggest consumer of salt is the chemical industry, which buys more than half of our production of salt. In developed countries from Northern Europe, large amounts of salt, usually humid salt, are used to stabilize soils, consolidate roads, and prevent people and vehicles from slipping on ice. Recently, it began to be used in the descaling of water, which now generates important consumption. Other, less important examples of use include the non-direct food industry, that is, the production of canned food and products for the countryside, animal feedstock, or prefabricated food. As mentioned earlier, cooking salt is the least significant in quantity, although it is undoubtedly the type of salt subjected to the widest variety of tests, like health control tests, packaging tests, transportation tests, etc. Some of the salt that is distributed directly in bulk, such as the salt used in soil stabilization or that used by brine food producers, is loaded directly onto trucks or ships in the case of the domestic market and on ships for the international market. An innovation of the salt lakes of Torrevieja is that the salt is carried directly to the ship by a conveyor belt that connects the salt production to the port via the Poniente Promenade. This way, the upload is very fast and its output is much more productive. Salt can also be packaged in 25 kilogram bags and big bags of 1,000 or 1,500 kilograms depending on the use. The Torrevieja salt lakes work with modern and efficient machines for packaging and storage. Our most important salt buyers are developed countries, mainly from Northern Europe. Norway is our main purchaser and uses the salt it buys both for soil stabilization and for its large fishing industry. Italy, Portugal, the UK, the US, Ireland, and Denmark are also among our main buyers. National markets for the Torrevieja salt include companies from Galicia, Catalonia, and the Basque Country. Torrevieja, charms to discover.